Reflections, Sustaining Ourselves Spiritually. Excerpts from The Holy Longing, The Search for a Christian Spirituality by Ronald Rolheiser. To pray, I think, does not mean to think about God in contrast to thinking about other things, or to spend time with God instead of spending time with other people. Rather, it means to think and live in the presence of God. All our actions must have their origin in prayer. Praying is not an isolated activity. It takes place in the midst of all the things and affairs that keep us active. In prayer, a self-centered monologue becomes a God-centered dialogue. Knowledge alone cannot save us. When St. Augustine coined that phrase nearly 1700 years ago, he meant it as a principle of truth, but he was also writing a commentary on his own life. Augustine, as we know, had two conversions, one in his head and the other in his heart. At age 25, he converted to Christianity, intellectually. After years of experimenting with various pagan philosophies and ways of living, he was now convinced in his head that Christianity was correct. The rest of him, however, was not as willing a convert. For 9 more years, until he was 34 years old, he was unable to bring his moral life into harmony with his intellectual faith. It was during these years that he not infrequently prayed his infamous prayer, "Lord, make me a good and chaste Christian, but not yet." We see from that example that it is not enough just to know the truth, to have clarity of conviction, and to know where ideally our lives should be heading, though that can be a valuable start. There's also the question of heart, of energy, of willpower, of sustaining ourselves on the road. The spiritual life is not a quick sprint to a well-marked finish line, but a marathon, an arduous lifelong journey into an ever-widening horizon. To sustain ourselves on that road, even after we have some assurance that we are on the right road, requires that along the way we continually find what metaphorically might be termed Elijah's jug, 1 Kings 19, 1-8, namely, the sustenance that God promised to provide to those who are walking the long road toward the divine mountain. Bernard Lonergan, one of the great intellectuals of our century and a pious Christian, insisted that all genuine conversion must involve an intellectual conversion. He is right, the heart needs guidance from the head, but his statement tells only part of the story. Morris West, the novelist, also a very committed Christian, insists that genuine conversion is ultimately a question of falling in love. He too is right, as any one of us who has ever known the truth but felt too tired, lonely, lazy, bitter, or addicted to old habits to move toward it can testify to. We need knowledge and heart. Spirituality is about both. How do we develop the heart to sustain ourselves on the long road? How do we move beyond our fatigue, loneliness, laziness, bitterness, and bad habits, so as to become gracious, happy, self-sacrificing, generative, adult Christians? What do we do during those times when, as Henri Nouwen puts it, we are too tired to read the Gospels, too restless to have spiritual thoughts, too depressed to find words for God, or too exhausted to do anything? What practices and exercises, analogous to keeping our bodies physically healthy, are helpful for us as we struggle as Christians to live healthy spiritual lives? There are many time-honored, canonized spiritual practices, as outlined in classical spiritual writings from Scripture down to our own day. Generally, the following practices formed the core of a healthy Christian spirituality: regular prayer, both private and communal, the practice of charity and self-sacrifice, both at home and in the wider world, some concrete involvement with the poor, involvement within some church community, and a willingness to be vulnerable for love, as Christ was vulnerable. From the Bible, through the early church fathers, through the medieval theologians, through the great reformers, through the great mystics, through the founders of the various religious orders, down to Henri Nouwen, these are the spiritual practices you see everywhere emphasized. Nothing has changed. These are still the core practices for a healthy spiritual life. Given the particular struggles of our own time, what are the signs of the times for today? What is unique to us, and what particular exercises and practices do we need today in order to sustain ourselves, given our own peculiar struggles? The signs of the times seem to dictate several complementary directions. This video will address one of the 4 terms, what are referred to as the commandments for the long haul presented by the author. The presentation of this subject is distinctive due to the inherent connotation of the term mystic, which typically implies involvement in cultic rituals or magical practices. Nevertheless, The author presents a contrasting perspective on the term when viewed through the lens of the Christian worldview. The time is fast approaching when one will either be a mystic or an unbeliever. Karl Rahner is credited with making the statement that today one is either a mystic or a non-believer. He is right. None of us can rely any longer on the fact that we live in a culture that was once Christian, that we are seemingly surrounded by other Christians, or that we once had faith. None of these alone is enough today to sustain a Christian faith in an age which is as agnostic, pluralistic, secular, seductive, and distracting as our own. We live in a post-Christian situation within which the culture no longer carries the faith for us. Thus, to be a believer today is to live in a certain moral loneliness. To sustain faith today is not to vote with the majority, but rather to be what sociologists term a cognitive minority, that is, to stand outside of the dominant consciousness. One can no longer simply roll with the flow of one's own particular community, even one's faith community, if one wishes to have a living faith. 25 years ago, while teaching at Yale, Henri Nouwen had already made the statement that, even among seminarians, the dominant consciousness was agnostic. God essentially had no place, even among people talking about religion and preparing for Christian ministry. That is basically true for most of us today. It is no longer enough to have been born into a Christian family, to have been baptized, or even to be part of a worshiping community. None of these alone will necessarily give us real faith. This is evident not just because so many people, including many of our own children, are drifting away from Christianity, but because even within our churches, it is easier to have faith in Christianity, in a code of ethics, in Jesus' moral teaching, in God's call for justice, and in the human value of gathering as community, than it is to have personal faith in a living God. Too often what we have, in fact, is not Christianity, but an ideology of Christianity. Thus, there is an important challenge in Rahner's comment. To have a living faith today, one must at some point in his or her life make a deep private act of faith. That act, which he equates with becoming a mystic, is unfortunately itself very difficult because the very forces that have helped erode our cultural communal faith also work against us making this private act of faith. What are these anti-faith forces? They are not the product of some conscious conspiracy by godlessness. They are instead all those things, good and bad, within us and around us that tempt us away from prayer, from self-sacrifice, from being more communal, from being willing to sweat blood in a garden in order to keep our integrity and commitments, and from mustering up the time and courage to enter deeply into our own souls. Hence, they are not abstract foreign forces. They live in the house with us and are as comfortable to us as a well-worn shoe. What blocks faith is that myriad of innocent things within our ordinary, normal lives which precisely make our lives comfortable. Our laziness, our self-indulgence, our ambition, our restlessness, our envy, our refusal to live in tension, our consumerism, our greed for things and experience, our need to have a certain lifestyle, our busyness and overextension, our perpetual tiredness, our obsession with celebrities, and our perpetual distraction with sports, sitcoms, and talk shows. These are the anti-mystical forces of our time. So how do we become mystics in the midst of all of this? Virtually all classical spiritual writers from every tradition suggest one road beyond all of this: private prayer. Among classical spiritual writers, there is this leitmotif. In order to sustain yourself in faith, you must regularly, most would say daily, spend an extended period of time in private prayer. Failure to do so, they warn, results in a certain dissipation of the soul, even when our sincerity remains intact. There is no way to stay in touch with one's soul and to keep a balance there, outside of regular private prayer. Christianity has always taught this. Interestingly, today, many other traditions and philosophies teach this as well. Sometimes other words are used instead of the word prayer: meditation, contemplation, inner work, soul work, active imagination, contact with our inner king and queen, and so on. But the essential idea is the same. To stay in contact with one's soul and to keep some health and balance there, we must have some conscious dialogue with a god, a higher power, a daemon, an inner king and queen, a guiding angel, or whatever we conceive of as that ultimate something or somebody within which we live and move and breathe and have our being. Few have written on this question, our need for prayer, with more depth and eloquence than has Robert Moore, a psychologist and philosopher of religion from the University of Chicago. Moore addresses both secular and Christian audiences, but his message is ultimately the same for both. If you don't pray, you will inevitably become either depressed or inflated, or bounce back and forth between the two. Only prayer can provide for you that fine line, spiritual, psychological, and emotional, between depression and inflation. If you don't believe in God and the value of religious prayer, then practice some form of active imagination or meditation, and through them, get into conscious contact with the King and Queen inside of you, because only prayer can ground a soul, and only it can save you from being either a depressive or an asinine personality. If you do not pray, you will either be habitually depressed or obsessed with your own ego. This, according to Moore, is true, irrespective of whether you are religious or not. Hence, both from what is best in Christian and secular tradition, we hear the truth that sustaining a life of faith and a balanced life in general depends upon developing a habit of private prayer. Moreover, as these same sources assure us, we should not expect this to be easy. All the things that work against our faith also work against us developing the habit of private prayer. We must, however, continue to try, continue to consistently set a time to spend apart with God. As Henri Nouwen assures us, the time apart will keep us centered, even when it does not feel as if we are praying or making any headway. My time apart is not a time of deep prayer, nor a time in which I experience a special closeness to God. It is not a period of serious attentiveness to the divine mysteries. I wish it were. On the contrary, it is full of distractions, inner restlessness, sleepiness, confusion, and boredom. It seldom, if ever, pleases my senses. But the simple fact of being for 1 hour in the presence of the Lord and of showing Him all that I feel, think, sense, and experience, without trying to hide anything, must please Him. Somehow, somewhere, I know that He loves me, even though I do not feel that love as I can feel a human embrace, even though I do not hear a voice as I hear human words of consolation, even though I do not see a smile as I can see in a human face. Still God speaks to me, looks at me, and embraces me there where I am still unable to notice it. But prayer is more than just saying prayers, just as mysticism is more than a question of merely seeking God through formal prayer. Ultimately, mysticism and prayer are something we must do within all the activities of our lives, and not just in certain formal moments set aside for them. Pray always, Scripture tells us. But how does one do this? There are many answers one might give to that question, and depending upon how one reads the signs of the times, different things might be emphasized for different generations. For our generation, given our own particular spiritual Achilles heel, the brand of mysticism that we most need is that of pondering in the biblical sense. What, according to Scripture, does it mean to ponder? Pondering in the Gospels does not mean what it meant for the Greek philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. For them, to ponder meant taking seriously the dictum that the unexamined life is not worth living. It meant to reflect more consciously about things as opposed to simply rolling with the flow and leaving life to circumstance and chance. For the Greek mind, to ponder meant to intellectually contemplate life's great mysteries. Scripture, however, does not reflect this Greek mindset. In the Gospels, which exhibit more the Hebrew way of understanding things, to ponder is less a question of intellectually contemplating something, as it is of patiently holding it inside of one's soul, complete with all the tension that brings. Thus, when Mary stands under the cross of Jesus and watches Him die, and there is absolutely nothing she can do to save Him, or even to protest His innocence and goodness, she is pondering in the biblical sense. She is carrying a great tension that she is helpless to resolve and must simply live with. That is what Scripture refers to when it tells us that Mary kept these things in her heart and pondered them. Thus, to ponder biblically is to stand before life's great mysteries the way Mary stood before the various events of Jesus' life, including the way she stood under the cross. There is great joy in that, but there can also be incredible tension. The type of mysticism that we most need today to revitalize our faith is precisely this kind of pondering, a willingness to carry tension as Mary did. The author uses a rather earthly example, which I apologize for, but use nonetheless because of its clarity. The example is this. The issue of masturbation was raised to a professor lecturing on sexuality and morality. The student stopped the professor with a question. Do you masturbate? The professor's first reaction was one of anger at the impertinence of the question. He turned away from the class toward the blackboard, and his body language said what his words did not. "You are out of order with that question." However, he recovered himself soon enough and turned and faced his questioner and the class with these words. "My first reaction is to tell you that you're out of order and that you've no business asking a question like that in this class or anywhere else. However, since this is a class in moral theology, and in the end your question has some value, I will in fact answer you. Yes, sometimes I do, and I'm not proud of it. I don't think it's very wrong, and I don't think it's very right either. I do know this, though. I'm a better person when I don't, because then I am carrying more of the tension that we, all of us, should carry in this life. I'm a better person when I carry that tension." Whatever its merits or lack of them in moral theology, that answer says something about mysticism and what ultimately helps sustain faith. We are better persons when we carry tension, as opposed to always looking for its easy resolution. To carry tension, especially great tension, is to ponder in the biblical sense. We see examples of this in great literature. What makes for a great hero or heroine? What constitutes what we call nobility of soul? Usually we ascribe that quality to the person who, mindless of his or her own comfort, need, and pain, is willing for a higher reason to carry a great tension for a long period of time, not acquiescing to the temptation to prematurely resolve things. Generally, the more prior sublimation there is, the more sublime the experience. Great joy depends upon first having carried great tension. And this is true for every area of life, not just for sexuality. Nobility of soul is connected to carrying tension. The great illustration of this is, of course, Jesus sweating blood in the Garden of Gethsemane. There we see the necessary connection between suffering and faith, the necessary connection between sweating blood in a garden and keeping our commitments and our integrity. Nobody will ever remain faithful in a marriage, a vocation, a friendship, a family, a job, or just to his or her own integrity, without sometimes sweating blood in a garden. After his resurrection, on the road to Emmaus, in trying to explain to his disciples, who had slept through the lesson in Gethsemane, the connection between carrying tension and remaining true to who we are and what is asked of us, Jesus asks them this question: wasn't it necessary? In Jesus' message, there is a strong motif of waiting, of pondering, of chastity, of having to carry tension without giving in to premature resolution. The idea is that the resurrection follows only after there has been an agony in the garden. That is also true for faith. When Karl Rahner says that today we will either be mystics or non-believers, that can also be translated to say that unless we are willing at times to sweat blood in a garden, so as to remain true to our commitments, personal integrity, and the things that faith asks of us, we will not sustain a real faith. But why? What is the value in carrying tension? At a more obvious level, it is good to carry tension and not resolve it prematurely, because ultimately that is what respect means. By not demanding that our tensions be resolved, we let others be themselves, we let God be God, and gift be gift. This can best be understood by looking at its opposite. When we refuse to carry tension, and instead approach others and the world with the attitude that what we want should be ours, regardless of the consequences, our lives will always be more destructive than life-giving. Only someone who can live with the tension of an unfinished symphony will truly respect others. More deeply, however, the real value in carrying tension for the sake of love is that it is a gestation process. By pondering as Mary did, as she stood helplessly beneath the cross, and by enduring suffering as Jesus did in the garden at Gethsemane, we have the opportunity to turn hurt into forgiveness, anger into compassion, and hatred into love. We see an illustration of this in Jesus' life. He was hated, but he hated no one. He was met by anger, but he did not respond in anger. And he was killed by jealousy, but he was jealous of and hurt no one. He was on the receiving end of murderous anger, jealousy, and hatred, but he never passed them on to others. Instead, he carried hatred, anger, jealousy, and wound long enough until he was able to transform them into forgiveness, compassion, and love. Only someone who has already sweated real blood to remain true to what is highest and best will be able to look at his or her own murderers and say, "Forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." This is what constitutes true nobility of soul. Accepting to carry tension for the sake of God, love, truth, and principle is the mysticism that is most needed in our day. Almost everything within our culture invites us to avoid tension and to resolve it whenever possible, even at the cost of some of our more noble instincts. This is true for virtually every aspect of contemporary life, save those areas where we can be fiercely ascetical and sweat blood for purposes of our careers or the health and slimness of our bodies. Waiting in frustration and inconsummation is not our strong point. From minor frustrations like waiting in a queue at the bank or the bus, to more major frustrations with interpersonal tensions and our unresolved sexual needs, we find it difficult to stay inside of unresolved tension. Jacques Maritain, the great Catholic philosopher, once stated that one of the great spiritual tragedies is that so many people of goodwill would become persons of noble soul if only they would not panic and resolve the painful tensions within their lives too prematurely, but rather stay with them long enough, as one does in a dark night of the soul, until those tensions are transformed and help give birth to what is most noble inside of us: compassion, forgiveness, and love.